I have with me here Brian Earp. I'd like him to introduce himself before we start, because he's really active at the moment in the philosophical field. But could you introduce yourself for us, Brian?
Sure. My name is Brian Earp. I'm a research associate at the University of Oxford in England, working in various topics in philosophy and ethics. And currently I'm a resident visiting scholar at the Hastings Center, which is a bioethics research institute in Garrison, New York.
Absolutely brilliant. What brought us together was you posted a critique. Yeah, a critique of Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, and I read that and thought it was pretty much bang on the money, and I wanted to speak about that, and I asked you and you said yes. But before we get into that, I think it's important just to give a little context to talk about Hume's problem. Hume, famous Scottish philosopher a few hundred years ago, who developed the is-ought problem. So could you just run us quickly through maybe an example, or just briefly outline the is-ought problem?
Sure. It's been stated a number of different ways by different philosophers, and Hume's is one of the more famous examples. But the basic idea is that there isn't any logical way to get from a descriptive statement, a statement about facts, what is the case in the world, to an evaluative or normative statement, how the world should be. You have to have some other premise that you use to put forward your moral principles, and then you can refer to facts about the world and say, given this normative claim, when we look out in the world, what information is relevant to deducing how we should behave in light of that normative claim. But you can't just look at the world and say, because the world is this way, it follows that it should be that way, or that it should be some other way. There are some attempts to try to bridge this divide, to get from factual statements to normative or evaluative statements. Some of them are more plausible than others. I don't know of any that command universal agreement, but in the particular case of Harris's work, I didn't see really much of an attempt to bridge the divide, but rather to assert something like utilitarianism, but obliquely, without really taking ownership of the fact that that's what he was doing, that he was assuming this moral principle and then saying that science could determine how we should live or determine our values.
So let's you briefly put his argument from his book into three little bullet points. The first one is morality is all about the well-being of conscious creatures. I'm paraphrasing.
Well, when I first read Harris's book, I wasn't quite sure this is what he was doing, so I was interested to go to this lecture he gave in Oxford a couple of years ago, and I pressed him a little bit on this point. There's a sense in which saying morality is all about the well-being of conscious creatures is a kind of a common sense claim, and there's a sense in which some version of utilitarianism is something that most people would agree to without too much reflection. If the basic idea is all else being equal, you should try to make people's lives go better than worse, or improve well-being as opposed to detract from it, then most people would agree with that, and that seems pretty uncontroversial. But when you spell out what you mean by utilitarianism, when you spell out the implications of the theory, it turns out that there are paradoxes that sometimes follow. There are some people who think that there are other moral values besides utilitarianism that sometimes come into conflict with it. Justice is an example that's sometimes raised. There are different ways this debate can play out, but the point is that simply saying morality is all about the well-being of conscious creatures is either a sort of trivial common sense argument that doesn't get much traction, or else you're actually referring to a pretty thick philosophical debate about the basis for utilitarianism, whether it's a justified moral theory, whether it's in conflict with other moral views that might be more plausible, and so on, and he just doesn't engage with that debate at all. So either he's making a sort of common sense and, in my view, trivial claim, or he's pointing to something that really deserves more attention than he gave it.
I'll link that video. How did he respond to that?
Well, his first couple of words kind of prove my point. He said, the moment you grant that morality is all about the well-being of conscious creatures, then it follows that, scientific information, by which I guess he means empirical data about how things work in the world, can be relevant to our moral reasoning. But that was exactly my point, which is science can't tell us to grant utilitarianism. So if your overarching claim is science can determine human values, you have to show how utilitarianism is derivable from science. And when you ask him, okay, so what do you mean by science here? This is the part where I think there's a bait and switch. In this response, and as others have pointed out in various essays and critiques, what he means by science is basically something like rational inquiry or just philosophy. And that's fine. That seems like a sort of personal redefinition of the term science. Most people wouldn't think that that's what you meant when you say science. And indeed, I don't think people would have come to his lecture if that's what he had titled it. He said, who says science has nothing to say about morality? But what he really means is, who says philosophy has nothing to say about morality? Well, that's totally uninteresting. Nobody says that. Everyone agrees that philosophy has all sorts of things to say about morality. So he gets people in because he's taking this term science, which creates one image in their mind of what they think he's saying. And then when you press him on it, what he turns out to mean by science is something like secular moral philosophy. So I think that's the bait and switch that's turned some people off to his argument.
He uses another example in Moral Landscape, which you hit on as well, which I thought was quite interesting. He says, according to science, the Taliban, their treatment of women, making them wear burqas, is objectively, capital objectively, morally wrong.
Yeah, so this example about the Taliban is interesting, and I think it gets at what is probably a deeper motivation for Harris. The Taliban is obviously a religious group that would make certain moral claims on the basis of scripture or divine authority. And I think Harris is really interested to push back on this. He doesn't like that the moral conversation should be controlled by religious people, particularly religious people being the only ones who make objective moral claims to say this is the way it is because that's the way that God said it should be, or that's what I see in my scriptures. And then on the other hand, I think he's also concerned about developments in the sort of academic left, sort of postmodernism, cultural relativism, moral relativism, that says if something is accepted in some culture, then it's okay, or morality can only be determined in lights of local considerations. I think he's resistant to both of those things, and I am too. I think he's right to be resistant to that. I don't think that religion is the only source of meaningful conversations about objective moral rules, and nor do I think that a sort of naive cultural relativism or moral relativism is the way to go either. And I don't think it's the only alternative. I think secular moral philosophy is a good source of debate about potentially objectively binding moral rules that doesn't have to appeal to religion and that doesn't have to descend into some sort of relativism. But his strategy, rather than engaging with that secular moral philosophy literature, is to, I guess, just sort of call that all science, not really engage in the philosophical challenges and the thorny and difficult debates that are playing out in that literature, and then to say that science can determine human values, and then that's how it will be objective. That's how we can press back against the Taliban. I just don't think that's the way to go. And in any event, I don't think that that's what his readers expect when they pick up his book. That when he says science can determine human values, what he really means is philosophy.
Yeah, I think he makes that point where he says the frontier between science and philosophy he doesn't think exists.
That's certainly an argument you could make if you think back to the natural philosophy tradition. What we call science comes out of this tradition of natural philosophy, which there really wasn't a distinction. You think of many great thinkers from generations past. They were philosophers and scientists. They made rational conceptual distinctions, and they also looked around at the world and gathered data and tried to draw inferences from those data and so on. So there's another point he makes, which is also true, which is that science, if you think of it as somebody sitting in a lab running an experiment, a neuroscientist or something like that, it's certainly true that science does not exist in a vacuum with no values. There are, of course, values built into the very foundations of science. There are normative assumptions that play into how science is carried out. Things as simple as, for example, what kinds of questions should we fund to investigate. There's all sorts of ways in which values and sort of empirical science are wrapped up in each other. So that's a fine argument to make. But the problem is that that doesn't seem to be what he was setting out to do in his book. He was supposedly giving us an objective account of how we should behave and what we should believe. That's derivable in some way from what most people think of when they hear the term science. And he's fine to raise a more sophisticated understanding of science, but that's not why anyone picked up his book, and that was my concern. He's either saying something that's interesting but false, or uninteresting and true. And if those are your two options, I think you have to be a little bit more careful about how you present your argument.
You mentioned that there are secular moral theories which you think are viable, that may give objective, or at least working on objective moral values, etc. Which ones would you say were really doing some good work at the moment? Which ones are you looking at?
So I don't really subscribe to any particular moral theory, and often people will draw a distinction between so-called consequentialist theories, of which utilitarianism is a major example, and on the other side you often hear theories of that are so deontological is the saying. These are often sort of traced back to Kant, and the debate goes back and forth about whether you should adopt one form or the other, or whether on some level of abstraction both of them are really getting at the same idea. So I tend to make conditional statements just in my own work. I would say, if you agree with something like this utilitarian view, or if you're looking at this from a deontological perspective, what would follow from that? I just don't feel comfortable reaching back beyond that and trying to say that I personally have a view about something that objectively holds in morality. There are some people who are audacious enough to try to make that argument, but I'm not one of them.
Yeah. Do you think, cutting back a little, do you think science will ever be able to encroach upon any sort of objective morality?
Again, it depends on what you mean by science. I certainly think it's the case that empirical information about how the world is important to our moral reasoning. If we tried to carry out a moral argument and we just didn't have any consideration of what was really true about the world, the moral argument wouldn't get us very far, or else it would be an empty thought experiment. So the greatest possibility for science to help us out with moral questions is, I think, in the way that it's been doing for hundreds of years, which is to give us information about the way the world is, trying as hard, scientists are trying as hard as they can to rule out biases and other sort of extra scientific influences in the questions they ask, although that's hard to do. There's a lot of mess in science, which is something I've been researching a lot recently. Issues about failures to replicate major findings and biases in science and cultural influences in science and medicine and so on. So that's sort of a separate but related topic. I think the role of science is going to be what it's been for generations, which is to provide empirical information that we can use to follow our moral reasoning through. But I don't think it's ever going to be able to tell us what our moral premises should be.
You said you've been researching a lot into how science can be, for want of a better word, bullshit. Would you run us through one of the most recent articles you've written? Maybe we could speak about that. Just get into that a little bit.
Sure. I sometimes run into debates with colleagues of mine who are scientists. I have a background in philosophy and in science, cognitive science in particular, so I spend time kind of back and forth between these literatures. But there's this apparent need in public discourse to present this unified face of science as being this objective enterprise that really gets at what's true. And this is especially the case with hot-button political issues. You might have a bunch of people who don't think that vaccines work, for example. This is a huge debate going on in the U.S. in particular. And then scientists want to say, well, science has shown that, vaccines are have great benefit, very low risk, don't cause autism, and so on. Now, I'm not an expert in vaccines. I assume that that's true. But in the areas that I am an expert in, and I won't go into them in too much detail because I'm in this article I do talk about bullshit, and I don't want to call any particular person out for bullshit, at least not in this public way.
Yeah.
But, in the areas that I know very well in science and medicine, there is a lot of bullshit. There are a lot of articles written by people with lots of letters after their names who don't often check their references, or they'll cite something that doesn't really support what they say it does. They'll often make inferences about data that don't really follow. As I say in this paper you're referring to, I love science. I think science is the best method compared to all others that can get us at some sort of grip on empirical reality. But scientists are people. Scientists are flawed just like everyone else. They have cognitive biases and intellectual limitations, and there are also systematic problems in the way science is carried out. I mean, a major one is what's often referred to as publication bias against negative results. This is something I'm really worried about. For the longest time, journals would only or primarily publish studies that quote-unquote worked, that showed some sort of positive or interesting finding. And the problem with this is if you have, say, 20 laboratories running essentially the same experiment, and only one of them gets it to quote-unquote work, they get evidence of a significant effect. They'll publish that, but we have good reason to think that's probably just a noise, whereas the other 19 labs that didn't show anything, because they know they aren't going to get a publication out of it, they don't even write up their experiment. So now the published literature is distorted because it's full of probably these errors, these statistical errors that look like findings, and nobody knows about the other studies that were run that weren't published unless you bump into somebody at the bar at a conference and they say, oh yeah, I ran a study like that and I couldn't get it to work. So I think, when we're talking about science and what it can show us about either these difficult moral and philosophical questions, or just even, whether we should rely on what shows up in a journal article, I think we have to take into account the fact that science has a lot of work to do to fix these systematic issues in the way we get from running an experiment to what shows up in a journal article, and making sure that that's as sort of unbiased and objective as possible. And right now it's very far from that.
How would one go about fixing that system? I mean, journal applications, sending in journal submissions, etc., is already a notoriously difficult process. It takes a very long time to get reviewed, etc. Again, how would one go about sorting that, do you think?
There are a ton of interlocking problems, and there's not going to be an easy answer, but there is a movement towards sort of open data and transparent science, and I think some people are taking the right approach and gaining some traction and some steam. You mentioned peer review. That's such an interesting issue. In a lot of areas, peer review is not a very reliable quality control mechanism. Basically, an assistant or associate editor for a journal will take the manuscript and send it to 2 or 3 people that they think will give a good review of it. But sometimes the person they want isn't available, so they send it to someone else. Sometimes the reviewers are busy, so they give a kind of cursory read and send it back with just a few comments. So peer review isn't a particularly reliable way to filter out bad studies. Bad studies are published all the time, including in leading journals, prestigious journals. And so what often happens is that peer review just slows the process down. It takes, as you say, it could take 6 or 7, 8 months, a year for a paper to come out. And because we're waiting for 2 or 3 people to look at it, either well or not that well, or that carefully or not that carefully, and then it comes out, and then in the sort of post-publication peer review that's less formal, you often will find people will raise complaints about it right away. So I sort of think that we might be better to shift to a model where scientists publish their work in some format right away, immediately, so people can see whether it's any good, and then the community can weigh in on whether the results are reliable. People can double-check the statistics and rerun the statistical tests on the same set of data, so the data need to be available. So, to answer your question in a more concise way, I think a lot of these measures to try to make sure that the data that were collected are available so that anyone can look at them, that the methods that were used to run a study are very carefully described, not just in this cute story that often shows up in published articles, I think there should be pre-registration of study designs where people say this is what we're going to do. Now, some people are concerned that would be too limiting. They say, well, sometimes you have to just run an experiment. You don't know what is going to happen. Maybe you'll discover something. The problem is that often in this case, scientists will collect data and then they'll run a statistical test and not really show anything, and then they'll run 2 or 3 or 4 other statistical tests because they're kind of fishing around and seeing what's going on, and then at one point they find something that looks like an effect, so they write that up. Well, it's okay to do exploratory analyses like that, but then you have to say that that's what you're doing. You have to say that was an exploratory analysis, and we ran 5 or 6 different tests on the same set of data, which if you let your reader know that, they'll know to take your finding with a grain of salt because the chance of getting an error has been increased in most cases. So, there's no simple solution, as you can tell by my rambling answer, but data transparency and making the process of science more open and available for others to look at each other's work, I think would be a good first step.
Yeah, well, we're speaking about science, we're speaking about morality, we're going down that sort of road, so I think we have to encroach upon free will. I think would you be okay touching upon that?
Well, we can talk about free will. It's been a while since I've been digging into the sort of metaphysical literature on free will, but we can chat about it and see if I have anything interesting to say.
Excellent. Well, what's your stance on free will? Where do you stand?
I think it comes down with a lot of, as with the similar issues like consciousness, it comes down to what you mean by the term. I once read a paper about consciousness that somebody did a study and showed that something like 42 or 45 definitions of the word consciousness are swirling around in the literature, and you can go to a conference on consciousness and nobody's talking about the same thing. And I think a similar thing is true about free will. Harris has a conception of free will that some people have criticized him for. They say basically he defines free will in such a way that it can't exist, and then says, look, it doesn't exist, and we don't have free will, and here's all the things that follow from that. Other people, like Dennett, try to talk about free will in a way that's compatible with a physicalist picture of the world. Nobody in philosophy today wants to say that there's something like a soul or an unmoved mover, a first cause, a homunculus in our heads that somehow spontaneously and magically causes us to do things that were not determined by prior states of the world. It's really hard to think how that could happen. So if you define free will as something like that, then probably we don't have free will like that. At least it would be very hard to make sense of the world working that way. But if you want to talk about free will as something like the ability to make flexible decisions in response to the environment, and that people can have more or less of the ability to do that, then you might be able to get some more traction and have a meaningful conversation. But I've used to write papers about free will, and I realized that it was, to my mind, just circling around different definitions and people talking past each other. So I sort of moved away from that in the last couple of years. But every once in a while, I'll circle back and see if anybody's saying anything interesting about free will. But people have been debating this for hundreds of years, and I haven't seen anything new come out of it that's swayed the debate in any interesting way in recent memory.
Perhaps, there has been some interesting work in. I think it's called quantum cognition, something like that, where they're starting to. They say they're starting to uncover certain things about the brain with quantum procedures.
Listen, I'm not an expert on quantum theory, and I'm not an expert on free will, but a lot of these views seem to be trying to find something that's not determined. They're trying to find a sort of gap in the causal order and say, free will exists in that gap. But when you press people on this and you say, well, hold on exactly. What exactly is the relationship between this quantum indeterminacy, let's say, or some process in the brain that isn't traditionally causally closed in a deterministic fashion? How do you get from that to any reasonable theory of free will, and often that's where it starts to break down. So there's something intuitive about the idea that if you could point to some system or process that isn't causally closed or isn't deterministic in the classical sense, that seems like the place you would want to look for free will in the common sense definition of the term free will. But I haven't seen anybody do this, and again, I'm not an expert, so don't put too much weight on this. I haven't seen anybody do that in a way that's convinced me to want to look into it any further. But maybe there are some really great papers out there that I just haven't come across, and somebody really has solved the free will issue with quantum mechanics. I think that's extremely unlikely, but maybe that's the case.
Did you hear about Sam and Dennett having an argument? Did you read anything about that?
I saw their long exchange. It was interesting because I know that they agree on a lot of issues, and there seemed to be a lot of personal tension and disagreement on this issue, and claims of the other person not reading the argument charitably and so on. I did read it when it came out, but I haven't studied it recently.
I think Dennett came a bit forcefully because Sam completely dismissed his position in his book.
Well, this is something I don't remember if I said this before or after we started recording, but Harris dismissed a lot of philosophy in his book, The Moral Landscape. The quote that comes to mind is in a footnote at the end of the book, an endnote, where he says, the more instances of terms like metaethics and deontology that appear in my book, the more boredom will exist in the universe. And so, I just didn't want to engage with the philosophical literature, and I wanted to go my own way. And, again, that's fine. If you want to ignore a whole set of arguments that have been hashed out for a long time by really smart people and make your own kind of argument, that's okay. But then I think what you would want to do is make a very, very limited, narrow argument that you can justify within the bounds of your own mode of inquiry. But he sort of wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to dismiss a lot of well-worked-out philosophy and then make extremely bold claims on the basis of the narrow set of conceptual tools he's allowing himself access to. And that's why I think some philosophers, anyway, are turned off by his approach.
I found it quite interesting. He used to reference, I'm not sure if he still does, Wittgenstein as one of his major influences. And I think when you consider Wittgenstein's stance on morality, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, very plainly put, he thinks we can't speak on it. That is the silent side to the Tractatus. He speaks about...
Right, you have to pass over that which you...
Yeah. Whereof one cannot speak, one must remain silent.
Right.
And he admits... There's a few passages of ethics in there, but the whole point that some people have read in, there's a really interesting paper, I'll send it you, by a philosopher called Chon, that tries to delve into the parts that he remains silent on. It's really interesting. Anyway,
I'd love to read that.
But to say that is one of his major influences, and Wittgenstein's whole conception of it was basically he was a logical positivist. He said that facts are how you construed meaning, and facts can't speak about morality. How can facts speak about it? They can't. You can't bridge the chasm of his or no. As you said, no one has made that jump. So I just found it very interesting that he lists him as one of his people that influenced him.
Well, it's very curious. I didn't know that he had listed Wittgenstein as an influence. I do want to say some point in this interview, and I hope you'll include it, that I like Sam Harris. I like his writing. When I was in my angry at religion phase, I found a lot of what he wrote to be very liberating and to give a voice to some of the concerns I'd had growing up, but couldn't articulate to myself. I was raised in a religious household and came to be skeptical and moved away from a lot of the dogmas of religion. And there was a time when reading Harris's work and Christopher Hitchens and so on was the pugnacious style that they had, particularly Hitchens in that case, was really wonderful. I love Sam Harris's writing. I think he's writes beautifully and is a model for clear expression in many ways. So this particular critique of the moral landscape is something that sticks in my mind because I was so disappointed at what to me seemed like philosophical immaturity and lack of sophistication, and a sort of bait and switch, which really bothered me as a reader too. He drew me in with what seemed like an amazing claim that science could determine human values, and then when you push on it even a little bit, it turns out that he means something else by science than what is implied by the subtitle of his book. So I raise these criticisms not because I have any beef with Sam Harris or think that he's not writing great material on other topics. But precisely because I appreciate his work in so many areas, I was disappointed by the moral landscape.
I would like to also agree with that. That, funnily enough, I was there too at one point. Hitchens and Harris, and they were the people that got me thinking about these things, which, eventually led to me wanting to be a philosopher, I suppose. Exactly the same position. I do think he is an incredibly clear science communicator, but I will also say he is extremely irresponsible. In the sense that you just said, in the sense that to say to the general public, okay, first of all, that we can get moral values from science, well, that's just a lie. It's just a lie. It's just a lie. And secondarily, then to his booklet on free will, just to dismiss one entire side of the philosophical argument, as he did in the moral landscape.
Yeah, and while we're circling back to this issue, I want to just give credit to a couple of other philosophers who have written about this in much more length than I have. I mean, I have the sort of informal piece that you happen to read, but Massimo Pigliucci has done a lot of good work on this and is concerned about scientism. He's been a sort of leading critic of scientism and the scientistic turn among new atheists, as he puts it in one of his papers. So Massimo Pigliucci, I want to give a shout out to him. Russell Blackford has a nice review of Harris's book in his Journal of Evolution and Technology that I would recommend that people read. And I think that the most sophisticated critique is probably Whitley Kaufman's paper, Can Science Determine Moral Values, in the Journal of Neuroethics. So if people want a really sustained discussion, and I essentially agree with all three of these authors, I happen to sort of independently come to basically the same conclusions and the same kind of an analysis. But they carry it forward in much more detail than I do in my little piece. So I just want to put their names out there for people to consider.
I love Russell Blackford's work, and I spoke with Massimo last week. I'll link the interview. But
that's great.
Yeah. He spoke about the relationship between science and philosophy, and how he thinks it should be one of mutual help and mutual respect. And while they don't, they're not the same thing. They have been in the past, as you pointed out, and that they bridge off. But he thinks now it should be one of mutual respect, where philosophers can help scientists now and again, and obviously without a good scientific grounding, any sort of philosophy is blind.
Similarly, without a good sense of philosophy of science, I mean, that's part of the problem, I think, with a lot of contemporary science, by the way, is this sort of lack of consideration for great work in philosophy of science, which tries to clarify what we can really learn from an experiment. Or if you want to talk about the current so-called replication crisis, this is what I've been looking into recently. There's a great philosophical literature on the philosophy of replication. If you repeat an experiment a second time, in what sense is it the same experiment? Obviously some time has passed. If you're doing a psychology experiment, you have different participants who are in the room. Does that matter? What can we conclude from that? There's a further question of what you mean by replication. Is a successful replication getting the exact same p-value or the exact same effect size? Well, you wouldn't actually expect to get that based on some other considerations. So I think philosophy of science has a lot to offer to practicing scientists sitting at the bench and writing up their papers. And just as you say, philosophy that doesn't take into consideration what the best scientific conclusions that have been drawn is blind. And I see that happen a lot in moral philosophy. I see moral philosophers refer blandly to cases that really involve real people, and that there are some real data that might change your intuitions, but because they're sitting there with their heads in the clouds making these thought experiments, they don't bother to look into the issue and actually read the scientific papers, much less do so critically. And I think that philosophy, a lot of moral philosophy, and even very applied sort of medical ethics work, really suffers from the unwillingness of many people in the philosophy tradition to read science and learn how to read it critically. So I completely agree with you, and I agree with Massimo.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, I think that is the perfect point to end it on. So I really appreciate you speaking to me, Brian. It's been a great. So do you have anything else you want to add?
No, thanks for the conversation. This was really fun, and I appreciate your reaching out to me, and happy to talk more about any of these issues anytime.
Thank you. Well, I'll link your academic page and I'll link your Twitter in the page that I post this on. Anyone that's listening, check out Brian's work. He's publishing constantly. He's probably the most productive philosopher I've ever seen. So, refresh that page every other day and you'll be given a litany of new stuff. It's really good stuff as well. It's really interesting. Some of it is, it's not only good, it's really testing the boundaries, which I like to see. So again, sorry, go on, Brian.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate the compliment, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again for this great conversation.